The withdrawal did not begin with an announcement. There was no broadcast, no formal declaration, no angry speech transmitted across galactic channels. It began with paperwork. Quiet, polite, perfectly filed paperwork. Megan Cross spent the first 3 days sending notices. She sat at her console, aboard the Steadfast, and typed message after message, each one formatted exactly the same way. She addressed every council office, every joint operation, every shared station and cooperative mission where humans were involved. The messages were short. They thanked the recipient for the partnership. They stated that all human personnel and assets were being recalled to human-controlled space, effective immediately. They wished the recipient well. And then they ended. No explanation, no reason, no emotion at all. Greg Soto was 8,000 light-years away when he received his recall orders. He was on a Keth border world called Vetha 4, a rocky planet with thin air and orange dust that got into everything. He had been there for 3 years, running a medical outpost that served the local Keth population. When he arrived, a respiratory plague had been killing hundreds every month. The Keth had medicine, but they did not have the filtration technology to clean the air inside their settlements. Greg had built those filtration systems himself, using parts he ordered from Earth and parts he pulled from broken machines he found in junk piles. He had trained 24 Keth medics. He had carried sick children on his back through dust storms to reach the treatment center because the transport vehicles kept breaking down and nobody else was coming to fix them. His closest colleague on Vetha 4 was a Keth medic named Torath. Torath had 4 arms like all Keth and used every one of them when she worked. She was fast and smart, and had learned more about human medicine in 3 years than most people learned in 10. When Greg told her he was leaving, she stopped what she was doing and looked at him for a long time. She asked him why. Greg smiled the way he always did, with his whole face, and said his people needed him back home. He did not explain further. He could not explain further, because the recall orders did not include a reason, and even if they had, Greg was not sure he could put it into words that would make sense to someone who had not been sitting in that amphitheater, watching the council laugh. Torath did not ask again. She was quiet for the rest of the day. When Greg boarded his transport the next morning, she was standing at the landing pad. She handed him a small carved stone, a Ket token of gratitude, and told him he was welcome back any time. Greg took it and held it tight, and said nothing because his throat had closed up, and he did not trust his voice. The transport lifted off, and Greg watched Vetha 4 shrink in the window. The filtration systems would keep running for a while. He had built them to last. But filters needed replacing, seals needed adjusting, and the power units needed recalibration every 60 days. Without someone who understood the systems, they would eventually fail. Greg knew this. He tried not to think about it. Across the galaxy, the same thing was happening everywhere. On a deep space mining platform called Rig 17, human engineers began shutting down the systems they had designed and built over the past 5 years. The rig was a joint operation between 4 species, but the structural engineering, the load-bearing calculations, and the safety protocols were all human work. The other species had provided raw labor and materials, but the brains of the operation had always been human. A Valurian site manager watched the human team pack up their equipment and asked when they would be back. The lead engineer, a quiet woman named Carla Webb, told him they would not be back. She handed him a data chip containing the maintenance schedules and operating manuals, and told him to follow them exactly. He looked at the chip like she had handed him something written in a language he did not speak, which, in a way, she had. On the border defense stations, human soldiers rotated out one by one. These were the stations nobody else wanted, placed at the edges of council-controlled space, where pirate fleets and unaligned species liked to test their luck. The humans had been manning these stations for years, often in small teams, often without backup, often in conditions that more established species considered unacceptable. They had held the line not because it was easy, but because someone had to, and nobody else had volunteered. A Torvan commander, named Vosk, arrived at Border Station 9 to take over from the departing human team. He found the station clean, organized, and running perfectly. Every system was labeled. Every duty rotation was documented. The human team leader, a young sergeant named Pete Harmon, walked Vosk through the entire station in 4 hours, showing him everything from the weapon systems to the water recyclers. When he was done, Pete shook Vosk's hand, which confused Vosk because Torvan did not shake hands, and then Pete boarded his shuttle and left. Vosk looked around the empty station and realized, for the first time, that he had no idea how most of the equipment worked. The labels were in human standard script, which he could read, but the logic behind the systems was human logic. And that was something else entirely. Humans had a way of building things that worked perfectly, as long as you understood how they thought. If you did not understand how they thought, the systems became puzzles with no obvious solution. He sent a message to Torvan Command asking for additional training materials. The response he received told him to figure it out. Back on the Steadfast, Megan Cross finished the last of her messages and closed her console. She told Danny that it was done. Every notice had been sent. Every channel had been formally closed. Danny thanked her and told her to get some rest. Delegate Sitha received her notice 3 hours later. She read it twice. Then she opened a direct channel to Laura Bishop. The channel returned an error. She tried Danny Hale. Same error. She tried every human diplomatic frequency she had on file, and every single one came back silent. She sat in her quarters aboard the Keth delegation ship and stared at her console. She thought about the vote. She thought about the moment when Drawn had mocked the humans, and she had said nothing. She had agreed with Laura's data. She had known the threat was real. But she had not spoken, because the Keth did not like to stand alone in a vote, and because speaking up for the humans would have made her look weak in front of the council. Now the humans were gone, and her console was dark, and she had no one to call. The council learned about the withdrawal the way large organizations usually learn about important things, slowly and from the bottom up. A supply officer on Grand Accord Station noticed that human trade shipments had stopped arriving. A communications technician reported that several relay frequencies had gone offline. A Border Patrol commander filed a report noting that human soldiers had vacated 3 stations in his sector without explanation. These reports filtered upward through layers of bureaucracy until they eventually reached High Arbiter Zorath's desk. He read the summary while eating his morning meal, a nutrient paste that Valurians consumed through a thin tube. He noted the withdrawal and dictated a brief response, calling it an emotional reaction from a young species that would pass in time. He then moved on to other business. War Marshal Drawn, when he heard the news, laughed again. He stood in the officers' mess aboard his flagship and told his commanders that the humans had finally done something smart by getting out of the way. He said the galaxy had been carrying them long enough. Several of his officers agreed. 1 or 2 did not, but they knew better than to say so. Lorekeeper Eni heard the news in her archive vessel, a massive ship filled with records stretching back thousands of years. She was old, even by Fellerai standards, which meant she was very old indeed. Her body was enormous, slow-moving, and built for deep water. But her mind was sharp, and it worked in patterns that most other species could not follow. She did not laugh. She did not dismiss the withdrawal. She pulled up every record she had of human involvement in galactic affairs and began reading. She read for 2 days straight, cross-referencing data, building connections, mapping relationships, and when she was done she floated in her tank and said nothing for a very long time. Outside her window, the galaxy turned the way it always did, bright and vast, and full of things that did not yet understand what they had lost. The first sign of trouble came from the hyperspace relay network. The relays were ancient, older than any living species. They were scattered across the galaxy like a chain of lighthouses, each one amplifying and directing signals that allowed faster-than-light communication and travel between systems. Nobody knew who had built them. Every species simply used them, the same way people used roads without thinking about who would pave them. But the relays needed constant calibration. Their signal patterns drifted over time, and if the drift was not corrected, travel routes became unreliable. Ships would arrive minutes late, then hours late, then not at all. For centuries, different species had contributed their own calibration methods, but none of them worked particularly well. The relays were temperamental, and every fix seemed to create a new problem somewhere else. Within their first decade of galactic membership, a team of human mathematicians and engineers had developed a unified calibration protocol that worked across the entire network. It was elegant, simple, and effective. The Council had accepted it without much discussion, and within a few years, every relay in the network was running on human calibration data. Nobody had thought to ask what would happen if that data was no longer being updated. 3 cycles after the human withdrawal, the first relay went out of sync. It was a minor relay on a secondary trade route, and the delay it caused was small, about 4 minutes on a journey that normally took 2 hours. The station that managed the relay filed a maintenance request and assumed someone would fix it. Nobody did. Within a week, 6 more relays had drifted. The delays grew longer. A cargo fleet carrying food supplies to a Valorian colony world arrived 9 hours late. The food was still good, but the colony had already begun rationing because they did not know if the shipment was coming at all. A medical transport carrying emergency vaccines to a Valori research station missed its arrival window entirely and had to reroute, adding 3 days to the trip. 2 patients died waiting. The Council's Communications Bureau tried to recalibrate the relays using older protocols. The older protocols made things worse. The relays were now tuned to the human system, and layering a different system on top created interference patterns that scrambled signals for hours at a time. An entire sector of the galaxy went dark for half a day before engineers figured out how to undo what they had done. High Arbiter Zorath received a briefing on the relay situation and asked why the human's calibration system could not simply be copied and maintained by Council technicians. His science advisor, a thin Valorian named Paleth, explained that the system was not just a set of numbers. It was a living algorithm that adapted to each relay's individual drift pattern. Updating it required a specific kind of mathematical thinking that humans seemed to do naturally and that other species found extremely difficult. Paleth compared it to asking someone who had never heard music to conduct an orchestra. The notes were all there on paper, but knowing when to play them was something else entirely. Zorath told Paleth to figure it out. Paleth said he would try. The mining rigs were next. Rig 17, the deep space platform where Carla Webb had handed over a data chip full of maintenance schedules, began showing structural warnings within days of the human departure. The Valorian site manager followed the maintenance schedules exactly, or at least he tried to. But the schedules assumed a level of understanding about load distribution and material stress that he simply did not have. When a warning light told him that support beam 7 was under excess strain, he looked at the manual and found instructions that referenced 3 other systems he did not understand. He made his best guess. His best guess was wrong. Support beam 7 buckled at midday. The entire lower section of Rig 17 shifted 6 meters to the left. Alarms went off everywhere. Workers scrambled for evacuation pods. The rig did not collapse, not entirely, but it was badly damaged and had to be shut down. 200 workers were evacuated. 12 were injured. One was killed, crushed by a falling equipment rack that had been improperly secured after the human team left. 2 other rigs in the same sector reported similar problems within the month. One was evacuated in time. The other was abandoned entirely, left to drift in the asteroid field it had been built to mine, a dead structure worth more money than most planets. The Council's Economic Committee calculated the losses and presented them to the full assembly. The numbers were large enough to make several delegates physically uncomfortable. War Marshal Drawn, who did not care about economics, waved the report away and said that rigs could be rebuilt. He had bigger concerns. The border was failing. Vosk, the Torvan commander who had taken over Border Station 9 from Pete Harmon, and spent 3 weeks trying to understand the station's defense systems. He was a competent soldier, trained in Torvan military tradition, which valued strength, discipline, and direct confrontation. The problem was that the station's defense systems were not designed for direct confrontation. They were designed by humans, and humans fought differently. The systems were built around prediction and flexibility. They monitored incoming threats, calculated probable attack patterns, and offered multiple response options ranked by effectiveness. The idea was that a small crew could defend against a much larger force by being smarter and faster rather than stronger. It was a brilliant system. It was also completely useless if you did not understand the logic behind the recommendations, because the system's suggestions often seemed wrong to someone trained in conventional tactics. It would say to fire left when the enemy was on the right. It would say to power down shields when every instinct said to raise them. It took a human way of thinking to see why those counterintuitive moves worked. Vosk did not have a human way of thinking. He overrode the system and fought the way Torvan soldiers were trained to fight. The first raiding party that hit Border Station 9 was a group of unaligned pirates in fast, light ships. Under human command, the station would have predicted their approach vector, set a trap, and scattered them in minutes. Under Vosk, the engagement lasted 4 hours and ended with the pirates retreating only because they ran low on ammunition. The station took heavy damage. Vosk reported a victory. His commanders were not convinced. 3 more border stations fell into similar trouble. Raiders who had avoided the border for years suddenly returned, testing, probing, pushing. They had learned quickly that the humans were gone and that what replaced them was not the same. A colony called Sethan III, a small Keth farming settlement near the border, was raided for the first time in 26 years. The raiders took food, equipment, and a dozen hostages. The Border Patrol responded too slowly because their communications had been delayed by the relay drift. By the time they arrived, the raiders were gone. And on Vetha 4, Greg Soto's old station, the filtration systems began to fail. Torath, the Keth medic Greg had trained, noticed the first signs when the air quality readings in Settlement Block 4 dropped below safe levels. She opened the maintenance panel the way Greg had taught her, and found the primary filter clogged and the backup seal cracked. She knew how to replace the filter. She did not know how to fix the seal because Greg had always handled the seals himself, using a bonding compound he had mixed from materials that were not available on Vetha 4. She improvised with what she had. It held for a week. Then it failed again. The respiratory plague came back slowly at first. A cough here, a fever there. Within a month, the treatment center was full again, and Torath was working 20-hour days trying to keep people alive with equipment that was falling apart around her. She thought about Greg often. She thought about the way he smiled when things were hard, like smiling was his way of holding the world together. She wondered where he was. She wondered if he knew what was happening. Back at Grand Accord Station, Lorekeeper Ni finally requested a session before the full council. She was granted one because nobody said no to a lorekeeper, especially one as old as Ni. She floated in the portable water tank that allowed her to address the assembly and activated her data projection. The ceiling of the amphitheater lit up with a map of the galaxy. Then, one by one, Ni highlighted every system, station, outpost, trade route, relay, mining operation, medical mission, defense post, and research project where humans had been involved. The lights spread across the map like veins through a body. They touched almost everything. They connected sectors that the Council thought were independent. They linked species that believed they had no connection to each other. The web was vast and intricate and deeply, quietly essential. When the projection was complete, the amphitheater was covered in light from edge to edge. Ni said nothing for a moment. She let them look. Then she said in her slow, deep voice that the species they had dismissed as young and frightened had built the nervous system of their entire civilization, and they had not even noticed. The chamber was silent. Then the long-range sensors screamed. Every warning system on Grand Accord Station fired at once. The hollowed swarm had been detected. It was moving fast. It was much closer than anyone had predicted. And the galaxy's nervous system was broken. The first images of the hollowed arrived on a damaged probe that had been drifting for weeks before a patrol ship picked it up. The Council's Science Bureau cleaned up the footage and played it for the full assembly. Nobody spoke during the viewing. Several delegates left the chamber afterward and did not come back for hours. The footage showed a planet. It had been a jungle world, dense with vegetation and teeming with animal life. The probe had photographed it 6 months earlier during a routine survey, and in those images it was green and blue and alive. The new footage showed a gray sphere. The oceans were gone. The forests were gone. The soil itself had been stripped down to bare rock. Everything biological had been consumed. The planet looked like a skull with the skin pulled off. And the hollowed were already moving to the next system. High Arbiter Zorath convened an emergency session. For the first time in decades, every seat in the amphitheater was full. Even the minor delegations, who usually skipped council meetings, had arrived. Fear had a way of filling empty chairs. The military committee presented its assessment. The council's combined fleet was large, over 12,000 warships from a dozen species. On paper, it was the most powerful force in the galaxy. In practice, it was a mess. The Torvan fought one way, the Valurians fought another. The Keth preferred defensive formations, while the Falori favored long-range bombardment. There was no unified command structure, no shared communications protocol, and no common tactical doctrine. Every species had its own chain of command, its own priorities, and its own idea of how a battle should be fought. And the relay network was still drifting. Fleet orders sent from Grand Accord Station arrived late or garbled. Ships that were supposed to coordinate their movements found themselves in the wrong positions. A Torvan battle group jumped to a staging area and found a Keth supply convoy already there, sitting in the exact coordinates that Torvan needed. Both sides blamed each other. The argument took 4 hours to resolve. 4 hours that the Hollowed spent eating another moon. War Marshal Dron, to his credit, did not waste time denying the problem. He stood before the council and said what everyone was thinking. They needed help. They needed the humans. It was the first time Dron had ever said anything positive about humanity, and the words seemed to cause him physical pain. But he said them because Dron was many things, arrogant, stubborn, and proud. But he was not stupid. He had seen the footage. He had read the tactical reports. He knew that his fleet alone could not stop what was coming. Zorath agreed. He composed a formal message to the human government, requesting humanitarian and military assistance in response to a galactic-scale emergency. He used careful diplomatic language. He acknowledged that there had been a difference of opinion regarding the hollowed threat. He expressed the Council's hope that the two parties could put their differences aside for the common good. He sent the message on every available channel. Then he waited. 1 day passed. No response. He sent a second message, this one less formal. He dropped the diplomatic language and spoke plainly. He said the council had been wrong. He said the humans had been right. He asked them to come back. He said, please. 2 more days passed. Silence. Drawn paced the bridge of his flagship like a caged animal. He told his officers that the humans were punishing them. He said it was petty and childish, and beneath a species that claimed to care about life. His officers said nothing, because they had seen the council vote, and they remembered who had laughed the loudest. She lay in her quarters and stared at the ceiling, and replayed the vote in her mind over and over. She had agreed with Laura Bishop. She had known the data was solid. She had looked at the projections, and understood exactly what the Hollowed would do. And she had sat there in silence and let the vote fail, because she was afraid of looking foolish. On the 3rd day, she went to Zorath and told him she was going to human space in person. Zorath told her it was too dangerous and that the border zones were becoming unstable. Scytha said she did not care. Zorath looked at her for a long moment and then gave her his authorization. She took a small diplomatic ship, just herself and a pilot, and flew toward the edge of human-controlled space. The journey took 2 days because the relay drift had made navigation unpredictable. Twice, her ship dropped out of hyperspace in the wrong location and had to recalculate the route. When she reached the border, she found it sealed. There were no warships blocking her path, no weapons platforms, or mines, or hostile patrols. Instead, there was a network of sensor buoys arranged in a wide arc across the border zone. As her ship approached, the nearest buoy activated and transmitted a recorded message. The message was in standard galactic common, spoken in a polite female voice that Scytha did not recognize. It welcomed her to the border of sovereign human territory. It informed her that no diplomatic channels were currently open. It suggested she contact the Galactic Council's Human Affairs Office for further information. It thanked her for her understanding. The Human Affairs Office had been closed for weeks. Scytha sat in her pilot's seat and looked at the buoy, floating in the dark. It was small, maybe 2 meters long, shaped like a cylinder, with a blinking blue light on top. It was not threatening. It was not aggressive. It was just a polite machine telling her that the door was closed. She opened a communications channel and broadcast on a frequency she had used years ago during a joint medical mission with the human delegation. It was an old channel, unofficial and personal, one that Laura Bishop had given her in case she ever needed to talk outside of formal diplomatic channels. Scytha had never used it. She had kept it the way some people keep the number of a friend they never call. She broadcast her message. She spoke in her own voice, not the formal tone of a council delegate, but the real voice she used when she was not performing for anyone. She said she was sorry. She said she should have spoken during the vote. She said people were dying, and that the Hollowed were coming, and that the galaxy needed help. The blue light on the buoy blinked on and off. The stars behind it were very bright and very cold. After 2 hours, a response came. The voice belonged to Megan Cross. Scytha recognized it from the withdrawal notices, that same calm, professional tone that gave nothing away. Megan said the humans had received the Council's messages. She said they were aware of the Hollowed advance. She said she appreciated Scytha's willingness to come in person. Then Megan said something that made Scytha grip the armrest of her chair so hard her claws left marks in the metal. Megan told her that from the day the Council rejected their warning, the humans had been preparing. But they had not been preparing to help the Council. They had been preparing to survive alone. Every ship, every weapon, every resource that had been pulled out of Council space had been redirected into a defense plan designed to protect human territory and human territory only. They had assumed the Council would not listen. They had assumed the Council would not act, and they had built their plans accordingly. Scytha asked, her voice barely steady, if the humans would help. There was a pause. Megan said that decision was above her clearance level. Then the channel closed, and the blue light on the buoy kept blinking, on and off, steady as a heartbeat in the silence. Scytha flew back to Grand Accord Station and delivered her report to the Council. She stood in the same amphitheater where Laura Bishop had stood, and told them everything. She told them about the sealed border and the polite buoy and the calm voice that had explained, without anger, without cruelty, without any emotion at all, that humanity had moved on. The chamber was quiet when she finished. Not the quiet of dismissal, the way it had been when Laura spoke. This was the quiet of people who understood, for the first time, what they had done. Zorath sat in his chair and looked at the empty seats in the lowest tier, where the human delegation had once been. He thought about Laura Bishop, standing at the podium with her data and her projections and her simple request for help. He thought about how easy it had been to say no. Outside the station, the long-range sensors continued to track the hollowed swarm. It was 3 systems away from the first major population center. It was not slowing down. It was not stopping. It was not negotiating. And from human space, there was only silence. The Hollowed reached Vetha 4 on a Tuesday. There was no special reason it was a Tuesday. The Hollowed did not care about calendars or days or the names that species gave to their orbits around their stars. They cared about one thing only, and that was consuming everything alive. The first wave hit the atmosphere like rain made of teeth. Millions of small organisms, each one no bigger than a fist, fell from the sky and began eating. They ate the plants first, then the soil, then anything that moved too slowly to run. The Keth settlements on Vetha 4 had warning systems, but the systems relied on the relay network, and the relay network was still broken. By the time the alarm reached the nearest Council patrol, the Hollowed had already consumed a quarter of the surface. Torath was in the medical center when the sky turned dark. She grabbed the children she was treating and ran for the underground shelters that Greg Soto had helped build 2 years ago. The shelters held. The Hollowed could not dig through the reinforced walls, but Torath could hear them above, a sound like a billion small mouths chewing, and she held the children close and tried not to think about what the surface would look like when the sound finally stopped. The Council fleet arrived 6 hours too late. A combined force of Torvan and Keth warships dropped out of hyperspace and engaged the Hollowed in orbit. The battle was brutal and chaotic. The Hollowed swarm in space was different from the swarm on the ground. In space, they merged into massive living structures, organic ships that absorbed energy weapons and reformed after kinetic impacts. The Council fleet hammered them with everything they had and barely made a dent. War Marshal Drawn commanded the fleet from his flagship. He was brave, that was never in question. He flew his ship into the thickest part of the swarm and fired until his weapons overheated. They destroyed dozens of the organic structures, but the structures kept reforming, pulling material from the dead ones to build new ones, learning from each attack, adapting. After 8 hours of fighting, Drawn pulled the fleet back. They had saved approximately 3 million of Vetha 4's 4 million inhabitants. Over 1 million Keth were lost. The planet itself was dead, stripped bare, another gray skull floating in space. Drawn sat in his command chair and stared at the tactical display. The swarm was already moving toward the next system. His fleet was damaged and exhausted. He had nothing left that could stop it. Lorekeeper Eni, aboard her archive vessel far from the battle, recorded everything. She recorded the casualty numbers, the fleet positions, the sensor data from the swarm. She recorded the communications between panicked commanders, and the silence between transmissions, when nobody knew what to say. She recorded it all, because that was what lore keepers did. They kept the record, so that the future would know what the past had looked like, even when the past was ugly. She was recording the retreat orders when her sensors picked up something new, a hyperspace signature. Not one, hundreds. They came out of nowhere. 312 human warships dropped out of hyperspace in a single, perfectly coordinated wave. They appeared at the edge of the conflict zone in a formation so tight and so precise that the Council sensors initially registered them as a single massive object. Then the formation spread, and every screen in every ship in the sector lit up with human transponder codes. Danny Hale stood on the bridge of the Steadfast. The ship looked different from the last time the Council had seen it. The hull had been reinforced with a dark composite material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. New weapons systems lined the dorsal ridge, long and angular, designed for a purpose that no one in the Council fleet could immediately identify. Kevin Marsh had spent the last 14 months building those weapons, working from data on the Hollowed's biological structure that human scientists had been studying since the day Laura Bishop's warning was rejected. Danny opened a channel to the Council fleet. He did not address Drawn specifically. He did not address anyone specifically. He simply said that the human fleet had arrived and that they were taking over tactical coordination. He asked the Council ships to hold their positions and follow human lead. Drawn stared at his communications officer. For a moment, pride and relief fought a war across his face. Then he nodded and told his fleet to comply. Natalie Dunn ran the battle from the Steadfast's tactical center, a room filled with screens and data feeds and a holographic map of the entire conflict zone. She had spent months planning for this exact fight. She knew the Hollowed's patterns because human probes had been watching them since the beginning. She knew how they reformed, how they communicated, how the smaller organisms linked to the larger structures through coordination clusters, biological nodes that acted like brains for the swarm. She gave her first order. The human fleet split into 17 strike groups, each one targeting a different coordination cluster. The weapons Kevin had built fired focused beams of energy, tuned to a frequency that disrupted the Hollowed's biological bonds. When the beams hit a cluster, it did not explode. It simply fell apart, the organisms separating from each other like a knot coming undone. Without the clusters, the swarm lost its intelligence. The organisms became random, directionless, easy to destroy. The first cluster went down in 40 minutes. By the third, the Council fleet had figured out what was happening and began supporting the human strike groups, herding swarm fragments toward the human weapons. Drawn, to his credit, adapted quickly. He was not a man who let pride get in the way of winning. The battle lasted 9 days. It was not easy. The Hollowed were vast, and they learned. They began protecting their coordination clusters with layers of organic armor. The human fleet had to push through those layers, and pushing through cost them ships. The Steadfast took a direct hit on the second day that tore a hole in the lower hull and killed 14 crew members. Kevin Marsh sealed the breach himself, standing in a corridor open to space with nothing but a welding tool and a pressure suit that was 2 sizes too big. He sealed it in 11 minutes, which he later said was a personal record. On the 5th day, a human destroyer called the Franklin was swarmed and lost with all hands. Danny stood on the bridge and watched it disappear from the tactical display and said nothing for a very long time. Then he told Natalie to adjust the formation and keep pushing. On the 9th day, the last coordination cluster was destroyed. The remaining hollowed organisms, now mindless and scattered, drifted apart and began to die. Without the clusters to organize them, they could not feed, could not reproduce, could not survive. The swarm broke like a wave hitting a wall, and what was left washed away into the dark. The galaxy was silent for a long time after that. Laura Bishop arrived at Grand Accord Station 3 days after the battle ended. She came alone, without guards or escorts or staff. She walked into the amphitheater and stood at the same speaking platform she had used before, in the lowest tier, the seat assigned to the youngest and least important species. The chamber was full. Every delegate was present. Nobody was talking. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was laughing. Laura looked around the room, the way she had the first time, searching the faces. This time, every face was looking back. She spoke quietly. She said that humans had not come back because the Council asked them to. She said they had not come back because the Council deserved their help. She said they came back because there were people on Vetha 4 and a dozen other worlds who were going to die. And those people had never been given a vote in the Council's decision. They had never laughed at anyone. They had never dismissed a warning. They were just people, living their lives. And they did not deserve to pay for someone else's arrogance. She paused. The silence in the chamber was absolute. She said that the next time a human delegate stood at this podium and presented a warning, the Council would listen. Not because humans were powerful, not because humans would threaten to leave again, but because now the Council knew what it felt like when humans stopped talking. She said that silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard, and she hoped the Council had heard it too. She stepped down from the platform. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. High Argator Zorath watched her walk toward the exit. He turned to Lore Keeper Eni, who was observing from her water tank at the side of the chamber, and told her to make sure every word Laura had spoken was preserved in the permanent galactic record. Eni, in her slow, deep voice, told him it already was. Danny was waiting in the corridor outside. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the same tired eyes he always had. He asked Laura if she thought they heard her this time. Laura looked back at the closed chamber doors. She could hear the silence on the other side, thick and heavy, and full of something that had not been there before. She told Danny that she thought the silence had taught them more than any speech ever would. They walked back to the Steadfast together. Megan Cross met them at the airlock with a small nod and a cup of coffee she had saved for Laura. Kevin Marsh was already below decks, complaining loudly about the Council's docking clamps, which he said were the worst engineered things he had ever seen, and he had once built a reactor out of parts from a broken dishwasher. Greg Soto had already left. He was on a transport heading back to Vetha 4, carrying 3 crates of replacement filters and a new supply of bonding compound. He had a lot of work to do. Torath was waiting. Weeks later, the Council held its first session since the battle. The agenda was long and difficult, full of questions about rebuilding and reform, and how to make sure something like this never happened again. When the session began, a new human delegate took the speaking platform. She was young, recently assigned, and nervous. She cleared her throat and began to speak. Every voice in the chamber went quiet. Not out of fear, not out of guilt, out of respect for what silence really means, and what it costs to break it. The galaxy had learned many things from its oldest species, from the Valurians and the Falori and the Torvan, and all the rest. It had learned science and art and war and diplomacy. But it took the youngest species, the ones who had been crossing stars for barely a generation, to teach the galaxy the one lesson it had never learned before. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. And sometimes the people who come back after you have given them every reason not to are the only ones worth listening to. The Grand Accord Station hung in the black emptiness of space, like a silver ring someone had forgotten to pick up. It was old, older than most species in the galaxy could remember. The curved amphitheater at its center could seat thousands, and on this particular day, it was full. Delegates from 37 species filled the rising tiers of seats, their bodies ranging from tall and thin to short and wide, from scaled to feathered to covered in a kind of living glass. The air smelled like 100 different atmospheres mixed together, filtered and recycled until it tasted like nothing at all. At the very bottom of the amphitheater, in the lowest tier where the newest species always sat, the human delegation waited. Laura Bishop stood with her hands folded in front of her. She was not a tall woman. She had brown hair pulled back tight, and a face that gave away very little. She had spent 11 years in diplomatic service, first on Earth, and then out here among species that had been crossing stars when humans were still figuring out fire. She had learned patience the hard way. She had also learned that patience had a limit. Behind her sat Danny Hale, captain of the Steadfast, the ship that had carried the human delegation to this station. Danny was a broad man with a calm voice and tired eyes. He did not like politics. He liked clear problems and clear solutions. But he had learned a long time ago that the galaxy did not work that way. Next to Danny sat Natalie Dunn, who handled military strategy and spoke very little unless she had something important to say. Beside her was Kevin Marsh, the chief engineer, who spoke constantly and about everything, but who had agreed to stay quiet for this session. Megan Cross, their communications officer, sat at the end of the row, recording everything. Laura stepped forward to the speaking platform. A light came on above her, and every screen in the amphitheater showed her face. She began simply. She told the council that human deep space probes had detected a massive biological swarm moving through the outer rim of the galaxy. She called them the Hollowed, because that was what they did. They moved through a system and hollowed it out, eating everything alive down to the bacteria in the soil. She showed the data. She showed the projections. She showed what would happen if the swarm was not stopped before it reached populated space. She asked for a joint military task force. She asked for ships, resources, and coordination. She asked for the council to act now, while there was still time. When she finished, the amphitheater was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then High Arbiter Zorath spoke. Zorath was a Valurian, tall and thin, with a hard exoskeleton that clicked when he moved. He had led the council for over 40 years, and he had a voice like dry leaves being crushed. He thanked Laura for her presentation. He acknowledged the data. And then he said that the Hollowed were still very far away, and that the galaxy had faced threats before, and that it was perhaps too early to commit military resources to something that might never arrive. Laura opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, War Marshal Drawn stood up from the Torvan section. Drawn was massive, easily 3 meters tall, with gray armored skin and 4 arms that he liked to cross when he was being dismissive. He crossed all 4 of them now. He said loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear that the humans were a young species who had been part of the galactic community for barely a generation. He said they were afraid of shadows. He said they wanted to drag the rest of the galaxy into their panic because they lacked the experience to know the difference between a real threat and a bad dream. Several delegates laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The sound echoed in the curved chamber. Laura stood very still on the platform. She did not react. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Drawn for a moment, then at Zorath, then at the rest of the chamber. She was looking for something. She found it in the silence of the delegates who did not laugh, but also did not speak up. Only one delegate met her eyes. Delegate Scytha, a Keth representative with dark green scales and sharp golden eyes, sat in the mid-tier and stared at Laura with an expression that was hard to read. Scytha had been studying the data on her personal console since Laura began speaking. She had not laughed, but she had also not said a word in Laura's defense. The motion for a joint task force was rejected, 32-3. The official record noted the proposal as an exaggerated threat assessment submitted by a junior species. Laura's name was not even included in the summary. She stepped down from the platform and walked back to the human section. Danny was already standing. He could see it on her face before she said anything, but he asked anyway. Laura looked at him and said one word: no. They left the amphitheater together. Nobody stopped them. Nobody called after them. The council moved on to the next item on its agenda, which was a trade dispute between two species over mineral rights in a system that nobody particularly cared about. That night, aboard the Steadfast, the five of them gathered in the officers' lounge. It was a small room with a round table and a window that looked out into space. Kevin had made coffee, because Kevin always made coffee when things were bad. Megan had turned off the recording equipment for the first time in weeks. Natalie laid out what their intelligence teams had projected. The hollowed swarm would reach the first populated systems within 11 galactic cycles. That was roughly 14 Earth months. If nobody acted, billions of people across dozens of worlds would die. Not might die, would die. The data was that clear. Kevin asked what they were going to do. Danny looked at Laura. Laura looked at the window. Outside, the Grand Accord station turned slowly in the dark, its lights glittering like something beautiful and useless. She said they were going home. There was no argument, no raised voices, no debate about trying again or finding another way. Every person at that table had watched the council laugh, and every person at that table understood what that laughter meant. It meant the galaxy did not take them seriously. It meant the galaxy would not help. He told Megan to prepare a standard departure notice. He told Kevin to begin pre-flight checks. He told Natalie to start working on a defense plan that did not include a single ally. Megan asked if Laura wanted to send a final message to the council. Laura thought about it for a long time. Then she shook her head and said no. She said they had already said everything that needed to be said. The council had chosen not to listen. That was the council's problem now. The Steadfast undocked from Grand Accord Station at 3 a.m, station time. No ceremony, no announcement, just the quiet release of docking clamps and the soft hum of engines pushing the ship away into open space. Megan sent one automated message to the station's traffic control, thanking them for the berth and wishing them well. It was polite and short and completely forgettable. Within an hour, the Steadfast was gone, swallowed by the dark between stars.